In my quest to grow more mushrooms this year, I'm also looking at the different ways that I can grow them and how I can utilize more space in my garden. Now, in my last video, I've already shown you how I'm using my pathways as a medium to grow the King Stropharia mushroom or the wine cap mushroom, and I'm hoping to see the very first mushrooms pop up around the end of summer or the beginning of fall. Now over here you can see I have some logs stacked up together, and today I want to talk about how this is another way how you can grow mushrooms in your garden. First of all, growing mushrooms on logs is nothing new. People have been doing it for over 1,000 years, as far as we know. And it's especially being done in China and Japan, where they have whole mushroom log forests to grow shiitake mushrooms. Now, shiitake is probably the most well-known mushroom to grow on logs, but it's by no means the only one. And a little bit more on that later in the video. So, how does this work? Well, most mushrooms are decomposers, as they feed on the cellulose of dead or dying material, which is often woody material. Eventually, they will break this down into a rich humus or humus, which will then further enrich the forest floor, or in this case, even your garden or garden beds. Now, we as humans can take advantage of this process, and much like I've introduced the mycelium of the wine cap mushroom into my pathways, I can also introduce the mycelium of a desired mushroom into a fresh log of wood, which will eventually sprout edible mushrooms. Now, before I show you how you can grow mushrooms on logs, I do want to emphasize on the fact that this is a game of patience. I notice that a lot of people get discouraged or even completely abandon the idea of growing mushrooms on logs when they hear that from start to finish, so from inoculating your log to harvesting your first mushroom, can take up to 1 to 2 years. However, there are some pros to this process of growing mushrooms on logs, and you can even combine it with some faster growing mushroom side projects to sort of bridge that waiting gap, but I will touch on that a little bit later in the video, so stay tuned. Alright, let me show you how you can grow mushrooms on logs. Some wood types are good for growing mushrooms on logs, such as oak and chestnut, while some are better to avoid, such as conifer and especially cedar, because of its antifungal properties. I have 6 beech logs that I will inoculate. It's best to use freshly cut wood for inoculation, preferably no older than 8 weeks. Do let your logs rest for 1 to 2 weeks after cutting, as a tree has its own antifungal defenses which are still active in the first few weeks after cutting. I have 2 types of mushroom mycelium grown on wooden dowels, which will be hammered into the logs: shiitake and turkey tail. I have ordered these online, and as there are many suppliers over the world, it's best to do a Google search if you want to get your hands on some spot. After the logs have been cleaned from dirt, I like to mark the spots where I'm going to drill. Drilling is best done in a staggered or a diamond-shaped pattern to evenly spread the dowels and therefore the mycelium. Now it is time to drill. I like to wrap a piece of tape around the drill bit so I know the hole is deep enough for the dowel. There are ways to use an angle grinder with a special drill bit adapter to speed up the whole process, but I don't have one, so I'll just use my regular hand drill. Then it is time to hammer the dowels into the wood. You can clearly see the white mycelium on the dowels, and this is exactly what we want to spread throughout the log. Depending on the size of the dowel and or the hole, some dowels might just go in with a little bit more resistance. After these steps, most of the heavy lifting is done. Finally, you want to seal the dowels with some wax to prevent them from drying out and to make it harder for competing fungi to get into your log. You can use beeswax, but I use regular candle wax, which works just fine and is a lot cheaper. Sometimes a dowel will split at the end during hammering, so I use a serrated knife to cut the end and then seal it with wax. After an hour or 2, the logs were all done. I also sealed the cut end of each log to further protect them from drying out. Now it is time to transport them to the garden and make a suitable spot for them to stay. Since I don't have a lot of shade in my garden, I wanted to construct something that would provide a bit more of it. I picked a spot next to my compost station and leveled the ground as best as I could to place an old pallet there. After that, I grabbed a piece of shade cloth that was laying around to help suppress the weeds a little bit more. Everything I used was old stuff that was lying around the garden, which I saved for later use, so it might look a bit dated. Then I proceeded with attaching some wooden support bars to the compost station. These would then hold 2 little planks that would further support the top section. I then put 2 support beams at the opposite corners and then attached them to the pallet. This way I've created a nice support so that I can place another pallet on top. I can later replace it with a better countertop, so to speak, but again, I was only using material that I had on site at the moment. With this simple construction done, it was time to place the logs in their final place. So right now I have 8 logs over here, 4 with shiitake mushrooms, 2 with lion's mane mushroom, and 2 with turkey tail mushroom. Now these shiitake are obviously for gourmet or edible purposes. However, some experts actually say that all edible mushrooms also have some medicinal or health benefits. Now, another great example of this is the lion's mane mushroom, which is not only a very tasty edible or gourmet mushroom, but also has some health benefits, especially when it comes to your brain and, for example, regrowing your neurological pathways. Now, the turkey tail mushroom I'm growing purely for its medicinal purposes because it tends to be a great booster for your overall immune system. However, I can't get these benefits by eating them because they're way too hard, way too chewy. Instead, I need to make an extract out of it to gain access to the beneficial compounds. But in this video, I won't go into all the health benefits of the mushrooms or how to make an extract. That's maybe something for another video. So where should you place your logs? Well, you want to prevent them from drying out. So my first tip would be to place them relatively close to the ground so that they can benefit from the moisture of the ground. I've put mine on a pallet. This just raises them from the ground a little bit, so there's no direct contact with the soil, and so there's an additional barrier for other molds and fungi that want to get into your logs. Second, you want to place them in a shaded area. My garden doesn't really have a lot of shade, so that's why I built this little setup. But you want to protect them from as much direct sunlight and wind as possible. In my case, I could place an additional pallet here in the front because at the end of the day, there's a lot of sunlight hitting this side, or I could use some landscape fabric to create a little curtain. So growing mushrooms on logs, or growing mushrooms in general, is a great way to utilize some shaded areas in your garden that would normally not be fit to grow your vegetables. Alright, so you've inoculated your logs and you've put them in the correct place. When will you know when they're ready to start producing mushrooms? Well, a first indicator would be that there will be some white mycelial growth at the cut end of your log, so right over here. Some white spots might appear, or the entire cut end will become white, and that is a clear indicator that your log is pretty much colonized and ready to start producing mushrooms. Now you can let nature run its course and eventually your logs will start produce mushrooms, but there is also another way that you can sort of initiate this process, and that is by shocking or forcing your logs to create mushrooms. Now the way you do this is by submerging your logs in cold water for 24 hours in a big tub or an IBC, for example. This will trigger the mycelium to start producing mushrooms. After that, so after the 24 hours, you can place your logs vertically or stack them in an A-frame with some support. And this is just so it's easier for you to harvest the mushrooms, which will start to appear within 1 to 2 weeks after shocking the log. Once a log has produced some mushrooms, it needs about 6 to 8 weeks as a resting period. You can imagine that the mycelium has put a lot of energy into producing some mushrooms, and it needs to sort of take a breather after that. After that resting period of 6 to 8 weeks, you can then repeat the process of shocking your log, creating another flush of mushrooms. Now you can do this in the warmer months of the year, so say between April and October, depending on where you live. And this way you can get multiple flushes out of your log per year. Now I've mentioned it a few times before, but it can take a long time before you get your first harvest from a log, easily somewhere between 1 to 2 years. And that seems like a very big stretch to get a few edible mushrooms. However, I do believe there are some pros to this whole process. First of all, it's kind of a set and forget thing. So you inoculate your logs, you place them in the right place, and then you kind of let them be and you wait until they start producing mushrooms. Once a log does start producing mushrooms, it can do so over many years. Whereas, for example, a grow kit can produce 1 to maybe 3 flushes of mushroom and then the block is spent. A log can do so over many years. I've read several stories, but the general gist is that a log can last for up to 5 years. So the initial waiting time is long, but the reward period is also very long. Now, if you are impatient and you really want to enjoy some mushrooms, then you can of course choose to add some additional fast-growing mushroom side projects in your garden. So for example, I have my pathways that I'm growing my wine cap mushrooms on, but I also want to inoculate a straw bale with some oyster oyster mushrooms, and they will produce mushrooms within a few months, or at least in the same season that you've inoculated the substrate. And in the meantime, in the background, your logs will colonize and they will start producing mushrooms probably in the next year. And this way you can create some sort of overlap that will bridge the waiting gap until your mushroom logs are ready to spawn. So that's how you can grow mushrooms on logs. It is a game of patience, but I think it's a long-term investment that is well worth the wait. Now, it's going to take a long time before I can make a video on the results of my logs, but I will certainly do so when the time comes. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.